The following incident happened to two people, a young man and a young woman, who at the time were both councillors at a girls' camp. It took place on August the 7th, 1968, and the location was a Buff Ledge camp in Vermont. The two people involved in the incident had never been publicly identified, so to protect their privacy were given pseudonyms. The young woman was a 19-year-old water ski instructor and went by the name of Janet Cornell, and the young man was a 16-year-old maintenance worker who was given the name Michael Lapp. It was evening when Janet and Michael were relaxing on a dock that overlooked Lake Champlain. The two people were by themselves, as the other campers and councillors were off on a trip elsewhere. As they were looking out over the lake, they noticed a bright light coming towards them, which Michael initially mistook for the planet Venus. And as it drew closer, Michael exclaimed, "Wow, Venus is falling!" They then saw a white glowing cigar-shaped object. Then all of a sudden, three smaller white lights emerged from the bottom right side of the object. The lights then came closer to them as the main cigar-shaped object slowly moved away. The crafts then proceeded to carry out amazing aerial maneuvers and were obviously under intelligent control and seemed to be putting on a show for Michael and Janet when it did loops and then descended downwards. It slowly got close enough for them to get a better look at the object and could now see domed disc-shaped objects. After about 5 minutes, two of the discs went in opposite directions to the north and south and were emitting strange noises that sounded like thousands of tuning forks. There was now one remaining craft that came towards them, and as it got closer, they could plainly see that it was the size of a small house. Then all of a sudden, it shot up into the air and vanished, only to reappear and then plummet into the water about 1 mile away. But a short time later, the object came back to the surface and floated about 15 feet above the water while slowly coming towards the couple. It stopped about 60 feet from them and was now so close they were able to see inside a transparent dome. Michael was shocked to see two large-headed figures who looked short in stature with big eyes and small mouths and no hair, and both of them were wearing greyish-silvery uniforms. Their eyes extended around the sides of their heads. Michael could not quite believe what he was seeing and turned to Janet to get a response, but she appeared to be in some sort of trance. He tried to talk to her, but she did not seem to be able to hear him. Michael began to sense a kind of mental communication with the two beings and lifted his arms in surprise, and then one of the occupants mimicked his movements. Michael did not appear to be in any kind of shock and decided to ask who they were and why they were here. However, they did not respond out loud, but inside his mind. The voice sounded female and told him that they meant no harm. While Michael continued to ask them questions out loud, the beings responded telepathically and were looking for some form of energy, but did not provide any other details. That they were involved in a war with others of their race and described them as evil. He then asked where they were from, but the name they gave him he could neither pronounce or remember. Suddenly the two beings disappeared below deck, and the mysterious object then moved about 10 feet above their heads. All of a sudden a beam shone down that resembled a kind of liquid light. The sensation felt strange, as if it was shining in his head. Then Michael and Janet abruptly fell down onto the deck where voices and the sound of machines seemed to echo. Michael then grabbed Janet's shoulder and pulled both of them onto their backs on the dock out of harm's way, where Michael was suddenly overcome with the fear of being abducted and screamed, "We don't want to go!" But then everything went blank. As they regained consciousness, they found themselves lying on the deck and could hear two girls atop the bluff shouting something about a strange object. As the couple looked up, they could see the object shooting out beams of light towards the girls. The following day, Michael Lapp returned home and told his unusual story to his parents, but they were skeptical about what he'd seen in the sky. He also told his girlfriend what he'd observed, but she too doubted him. Strangely though, he did not discuss the incident any further with Janet Cornell, and they soon lost contact with one another. In the years that followed, Michael claimed to have had weird and frightening dreams about being on board a strange craft. 10 years later, in 1978, Michael Lapp contacted a man called Walter N. Webb, who at the time was an astronomer at the Boston Hayden Planetarium. Webb was able to trace the whereabouts of Janet Connell to Atlanta. Janet confirmed everything that Michael had said, where a big light had come towards them, where they fell down, and from there on, everything was a mental block. Then Michael and Janet were each separately hypnotized, where they recounted what they had experienced that day. Michael remembered standing on the deck with one of the humanoids looking into space and observing the Earth, Moon, stars, and the cigar-shaped object. Janet recalled being strapped to a table on the lower level of the craft while the two beings appeared to physically examine her. Michael was then placed on the table next to her. He could see these two small beings shining a light into her eyes and scraping her skin and took fluids from her body. The beings all looked alike, with large eyes, a mouth without lips, no ears, and two small openings for a nose. The beings also had 3 pointed web-like digits for fingers, and their bodies felt damp and clammy. When Michael regained consciousness, he found the craft had entered a hangar that was itself inside another larger hangar. He and the being then sailed on a beam of light through the wall. Then an elevator took them to an enormous domed room that was occupied by other humanoids who were observing something that Michael could not see himself. He was then taken to another room where he could see an unknown landscape, and whilst there could see human beings crying, but then lost consciousness. When he woke up, he felt himself falling through space as a globe full of TV screens with his picture on each one playing in front of him. He then stepped through one of the screens and found himself and Janet back on the dock. After the hypnotic session, they found that Janet Connell's story was less detailed than Michael Lapp's. She recalled feeling cold on the examining table, with something pulling her hair and pinching her neck. However, their stories were comparable when they were aboard the craft, and the description of the beings and the interior of the craft also matched. Walter Webb spent 5 years investigating their stories, but was disappointed when no other person at the camp was able to corroborate their stories that had taken place in August 1968, and he was obviously unable to locate the young girls that had seen the strange lights in the sky. Background checks on Michael and Janet showed that they were sincere and honest people, and were not prone to exaggeration. The abduction of Michael Lapp and Janet Connell is very similar to what many others have described, and is very similar to the famous case of Betty and Barney Hill that had taken place 7 years previously. Whether it was due to his abduction, Michael would later show an interest in religion and mysticism, possibly in search of more answers as to what actually happened to him that day and the real meaning of life.